Hi, welcome to everyone, and welcome to our four-part series, which will be focusing on the Jews in antiquity in the area of the Golan. And our first session today, our first lecture, will be a bit of background. When did Jews first come to the Golan? What archaeological evidence do we have of them inside of the Golan? And we'll be going through the time of the 1st century BCE up until around the end of the 7th century CE, focusing mainly on the archaeological evidence. So away we go. Today we'll focus a bit on the geography of the Golan. Where did Jews live? How was the Golan divided in antiquity? Where does the name Golan come from? What was it called actually 2,000 years ago? What sources do we have from archaeology on the Golan that we can learn about Jews and other societies that live there? And also we'll look a bit at the historical sources on the Golan, and we'll deal with the question today, when did Jews first come and settle in the Golan around 2,000 years ago? We have to begin a bit with the background of where modern day research actually began. Research of the Golan began in the end of the 19th century, kind of late in comparison to other areas in the land of Israel. And of course, the Golan was always considered more a part of the area of Syria, the area of southwestern Syria. And the first researcher to really describe the area of the Golan is a German researcher by the name of Gottlieb Schumacher. He came to the Golan in the 1880s. He actually came in order to plan the Ottoman trade route. But when he came, just like his British counterparts around the same time in the 19th century, he was interested in the archaeology, the history, as well as the different societies that lived in Golan at his time. And he left us a wonderful book called the Jolan, which up until 1967 was the main source that we have on the Golan, especially of all the archaeological sites that he saw and described that were there. Until today, we still use his research as one of the main sources about the Golan in archaeology. Where research really picked up again after that time, so we're now talking about a large period of time, a large area of time where there was not any modern day research, happens after 1967, after the Six-Day War. And after the Six-Day War, emergency surveys take place in the area of Judea and Samaria, and also in the Golan. The idea being that no one knows how long these areas will stay inside Israeli control. And as far as archaeologists, we have interest in knowing what's actually there. And so emergency surveys took place, headed by Shmarya Gutman and Claire Epstein, and they went through the Golan describing different sites. From their time and until today, there's been many different surveys taking place in the Golan, researchers excavating, surveying, and a lot of the information can actually be seen online. So if anyone's interested after this lecture to see more, go into the Israel Antiquities Authority website, and on that website you can see the area of the Golan marked off here in purple. You can easily go into the different sites and get a lot of information on the Golan, as well as a wonderful introduction, it's in Hebrew, by Moshe Hartal about the history of the Golan from prehistoric times until modern day times. So where does our information come from about the Golan and the Jews who lived there over 2,000 years ago? Well, we have two main archaeological ways of knowing. The first is from archaeological survey. For those who don't know, survey means that you don't dig, you go to different sites, you walk around, and you describe what you saw. You see remains of a synagogue, you mark it down. You see remains of a church, you mark it down. You collect pottery in order to date, but you don't dig anywhere. It's not a very precise method. It's relatively precise, but it's not very precise like excavating, but it allows you to cover tens, if not hundreds of sites in a geographical area, and it gives you an overall picture of what was there at different time periods. Another way, of course, we know is excavating. Here's a picture of our recent excavation at the site of Yehudia from this year. And in excavation, so it's a much smaller scale, but it's much more, of course, precise as far as dating and knowing what was there. The combination of the two is what gives you the archaeological information on an area. Now, the Golan is not mentioned a lot in historical sources. Our main evidence about the Golan comes from archaeology with some historical sources that we'll talk about today. And that's why it's important to understand where evidence comes from. It's based on surveys and some excavations that have taken place in the Golan. So let's give some background on the geography. When we say Golan, what are we referring to? Well, modern day Golan actually very much coincides with the Golan in antiquity. What I mean by that is that the border is more or less the area of Mount Hermon to the north, with the area of Panyas, Paneon being an important city up north. To the south, we have the Yarmouk River. To the west, we have the Sea of Galilee and the whole African Rift Basin with the upper Jordan to the north of the Galilee. And to the east, we have the Rokad River, which goes into the Yarmouk River, as well as volcanic tells, which give it a sort of eastern boundary. If we try and take a look where the Jews lived in the time period that interests us right now, the Hellenistic, Roman, and Byzantine time periods, again, from around the 1st century BCE until around the 7th century CE, the major area of Jewish living was in the central western Golan. It's an area some people know today. People like to hike in the Golan. It's the area around Katzrin, the gorges of Yehudia, Zavitan. But that's the area in antiquity where the major Jewish population was. What's interesting to think is that it wasn't just for 100 or 200 years. We actually know of Jewish presence for an area of around 800 years taking place in that area over there of the western central Golan. If we take a look broader, the Golan is a volcanic area which is actually connected to a larger volcanic area to the east, an area that we call the Kharat Sham, beginning in Saudi Arabia, continuing into the Syria, especially in the Syrian desert, making its way into the Golan today and ending in the eastern Galilee. On the picture from Google Map, on the satellite photo, you can see it well, has this kind of brownish area that appears going from east to west, and the Golan is part of this larger volcanic plateau. Here we can see it's divided into different geographical areas. So we have the area of the Golan, which you call today, again, I said from the Mount Hermon to the north, to the Yarmouk River to the south. And then to the east, the area which today is called as the Choran, which is also separated into different geographical areas. What's the importance of that? The different geographical areas in antiquity many times were divided into different ethnic areas, with different ethnic groups living in each different geographical area. So if we take a look at what we call the Golan Heights today, the Israeli Golan, in antiquity, and when I say antiquity, I'm referring again to around the 1st century BCE to the 7th century CE, it was divided into 3 main areas. The northern Golan, which actually then was not called Northern Golan, but was known as the district of Paneas, today what's called the area of Banyas, named after the major city of that area, which is on the slopes of the Hermon. To the south, we had the area of Hippos, which of course was named after its main city, Susita Hippos, or Antiochia Hippos, an important city in antiquity. And then we have the middle area, which is actually known as Golan, and the name Golan we'll talk about very soon, where Gamla was an important city, but wasn't actually the capital. And Gamla, I'm sure many of our listeners know here, was destroyed by the Romans in the year 67. And in fact, the area, the Jewish area, is the central area. Jews also lived in some of the other areas, but the main area where Jews lived is the area known as Golanitis in Greek, or Golan in Hebrew. If we look at the Roman period, so we're saying from the 1st century to the 4th century CE, we can see that these different geographical areas, which actually have differences as far as topography, soil, types of volcanic rock there, they also had different ethnicities. To the north was a group known as the Itureans, pagan group, locally of Arabic origin, which had temples on the area of the Hermon, and they lived in the Golan, and at some point in the 3rd century, they become Romanized, and we kind of lose them throughout history. To the south was a major pagan area around the city of Hippos, where a few Jews lived in the Roman period, and the major area where Jews lived, we said, was in the western central Golan, known as Golanitis. When we move to the Byzantine period, so I'm now talking from the 4th century to the 7th century CE, where the Roman Empire becomes a Christian empire. So we know of Christian groups living in the northern Golan and Christians living in the southern Golan, and Jews remained in the area of the central Golan as well. One more thing important to understanding the Golan is the routes that connected the Golan to other areas. There are a few Roman roads which have incredible preservation until today. It's one of the areas, the best areas in the area of Israel, if you want to see a Roman road, is to come into the Golan. You can walk on them, you can see the watchtowers, you can see the milestones that are there. And there was a major Roman road going from the Lebanese coast to Damascus, going by Banyas. And in the central Golan, which transversed the Jewish area, there is a Roman road that goes up from the Sea of Galilee, and then it cuts across the central Golan, making its way to Botzra, near the area of the Druze mountain, Jabal Druze, and to the area of Nawe, to the east of the Golan of today. So before we get into when Jews first come to the Golan, we have to talk something about the name. The name Golan we know from the Bible, and it actually is the name of a city in the Bible. And here we see it's mentioned a few times, and here we'll quote from Deuteronomy, from Sefer Dvarim, where it says that Moses set aside 3 cities east of the Jordan. These are known as cities of refuge. And we'll leave aside, for example, what their purpose was. What's important for us is the geographical mentioning of these sites. And it's mentioned that there's Betzer Bamidbar, Be'eretz HaMishor, La Ruveni, V'Ramot Be'Garad Gadi, V'Golan Ba'Bashan La Menashi. And the Golan was in the Bashan for the tribe of Menashe. What's important for us is that Golan is not the name of an area, as it is today, or as it was at the end of the Second Temple period, but Golan was the name of a city. I should mention that we do not know where the city is. We think the city is actually east of the area of the Golan today, but it's a city in the area known as Bashan. And most of what we call Golan today was either an area by the tribe of the Menashe, or was part of the kingdom of Geshur. But it wasn't the name of a geographical area at the time of the Bible. So it begins as the name of a city, and only in the time of the Second Temple period will it be known as the name of a geographical area. And as we'll see, it's not the name of the geographical area of all of what we call Golan today, but just of the central Golan. So we have an interesting development of the name Golan. It begins as the name of a city at the time of the Bible, and then it becomes the name of the central Golan at the time period that interests us, the Hellenistic Roman Byzantine period, and then it later becomes the name of the whole area as we use it today. So now, when did Jews first come to the Golan in antiquity? So we actually don't exactly know the answer, but we know it comes some point in the Hellenistic Hasmonean time period. I'm not talking about the Golan in the 2nd to 1st centuries BCE. Our main evidence of this time period comes from archaeological surveys. That's, again, archaeologists walking around the Golan, going to different sites, going on different hills, and collecting pottery. And based on the pottery, they can say this hill was settled in the 2nd century, in the 1st century BCE, at the time of the Hellenistic period or the time of the Hasmonean period. And here we're taking a map which were provided from the Antiquities Authority, where you can see different sites in the Golan from this time. What we don't really know from this site is the ethnicity of the inhabitants, but we know they were settled. So if we take a look at the middle area, which is what will become the Jewish area in the Roman and Byzantine period, we can see it's settled in the Hellenistic period. We can also see in the southern Golan there's some fortresses. And this is important in understanding where did the Jews come from. Well, we know it's settled, but we don't know if actually the people here are the Jews in the later time period. Our first real mentioning, where we really know where Jews are in the Golan, comes from Alexander Jannaeus, who's known in Talmudic sources as Yanai. And our description here about the Golan comes from Josephus Flavius. Josephus Flavius, the famous historian of the Great Revolt against the Romans in the year 70 CE, describes the Hasmonean conquest. And without his descriptions, we really wouldn't know a lot about the Golan. We should also mention he really doesn't mention the Golan a lot. It's kind of a side area, but the areas that he mentions are important because we do not have a lot of other historical sources to go on. And Josephus Flavius mentions Yanai conquering the areas of the Golan. And here we're taking it from Antiquities of the Jews. Josephus has 4 books that come down to us today. In 2 of the books, the Jewish Wars, Antiquities of the Jews, there's actually an overlap where in both of them, he mentions the Hasmonean conquest, which is great for historians and archaeologists because you can compare the different sources and look for discrepancies or additional details. So Alexander Yanai is one of the great conquerors of the Hasmonean time period. And by the way, you know he's a great conqueror because he's one of the only Hasmonean kings that can lose in wars, not only win, and his kingdom goes on. Alexander Yanai really spreads out the Hasmonean conquest, and he goes to the areas to the east of the Jordan, east of the Kinneret. He'll conquer the areas of northern Jordan of today. He'll conquer areas in Syria, and he'll eventually make his way into the area of the Golan today. And here I'm starting now from the 4th line in the source brought here from Antiquities of the Jews, and here it's mentioned on his conquest. And when he had taken the city by fighting, he marched to the Golan. So he finishes conquering areas in southern Syria, and he makes his way to the Golan. The Golan here is actually still a city. It's really the last mention of the Golan as the city before it becomes a geographical area. And it mentions he takes the Golan and Seleucia. Seleucia is another city, which until today we don't really know where it is. We just know that it's somewhere likely in the central Golan. And when he had taken these cities, besides them, he took the valley, which is called the Valley of Antiochus, which also we don't know where it is. Some archaeologists think it's north of the Sea of Galilee. I'm of the theory that it's in the area of the Rokad River, but we don't know. And he also took the fortress of Gamla. So all this is taking sometime around the year 80 BCE. And then Josephus mentions something interesting about Gamla. He says he also accused Demetrius, who was the governor of those places, of many crimes and turned him out. So he removes the governor. And if he removes the governor, some archaeologists say, why did he remove him? Because he was against the local population. Does that mean that the local population was Jewish? That's a question. We'll finish the source. And after he spent 3 years in this war, he returned to his own country when the Jews joyfully received him. This is talking about the Jews when he returns. Upon this, his good success. So these few lines about Yanai are one of the only sources we have as conquering. We don't really notice in the archaeological record. We know that there's sites that are settled, but it's hard for us to tell, were they conquered by Yanai? Did he switch over the population? Did he Judaize the population? Did the population convert by choice or forced conversion? And did he bring in a new population? All these are questions that we have. And even today, we have fights amongst ourselves, archaeologists and historians. We have disagreements about what was the local population when Yanai comes. There is a theory that some of them were Jewish, as I said before, especially in the area of Gamla, and that's why they didn't like the governor Demetrius, who was against them. And others claim no, Jewish settlement really begins only with Yanai. I should mention that it's possible that in the conquest of Judah Maccabee, of Yehuda Maccabee, there is a mentioning of a conquering of an area that sounds like Hispin, which might be referring to a city in the Golan. Again, there's also not consensus amongst archaeologists about this. And if that's the case, there also may have already been at his time in the 2nd century, some Jews living in the area of the Golan. Here we can see the map, a schematic map really, of the conquering of Alexander Yanai. And we can see he conquers the area to the east of the Sea of Galilee, including the area of the Golan. After the death of Yanai, there's more history goes on with the Golan. We know it becomes more of a Jewish area. And under the kingdom of Herod, so the area of the Golan isn't part of his kingdom. And the next king to really alter the area and build cities there, mentioned by Josephus, is the son of Herod the Great. Upon the death of Herod the Great, his kingdom is split up amongst his sons. And this also includes the area which we'll call today of Golan. And again, we know this really only from Josephus. So he's talking now about his death, about his will. And here Josephus mentions, and now Herod altered his testament upon the alteration of his mind, for he appointed Antipas, to whom he had before left the kingdom, to be tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. So his son Herod Antipas becomes the king over Galilee and Perea, which is in the area of Jordan today, and granted the kingdom to Archelaus. He also gave Gaulonitis and Trachonitis and Panias to Philip. Gaulonitis is the central Golan of today, and Trachonitis is the area to the east of the Golan, and Panias, the area of the northern Golan, he gives to Philip, who was his son, but own brother to Archelaus by the name of Tetrarchy, and bequeathed him Jamnia and Ashdod, and Pasaleus to Salome, his sister, with 500,000 drachmae of the silver that was coined. From this source we learn that the area of the Golan goes to his son Philip, and we'll know from other sources that Philip will actually build cities in the Golan. He'll build Caesarea Philippus, which is the city of Paneas, and he'll also build a city in the central Golan by the Sea of Galilee, where Beit Saida was, known as Julius, which today is being excavated in the area of Beit Habek. But the truth is, if we take a look at the Golan in the 1st, 4th centuries, besides a few other sources which are similar to the ones I showed you, we have almost no literary sources on the Golan, meaning our main evidence comes from archaeology. What we do know is that the Jewish settlement will continue from the time of Yanai. It continues even after the fall of Gamla, but we have very few archaeological evidence of monumental structures from this time, and we also know there'll be a decline in the number of settlements following the Roman period. The major event in the Roman period that probably some of our listeners know, and maybe some have visited, is from the area of Gamla. Josephus describes Gamla, and he describes the Golan, and we should look a bit about his geographical description to understand where the Jews were living at this time. And I'm going to go down now about to the 8th line, which you see over here, 8th, 9th line, and this is what he mentions. Gamla also, which is a city over Trikai, against Trikai. Gamla, Trikai is the area of Migdal. So Gamla is a city which is across the sea, across from Migdal, is on the other side of the lake, conspired with them. He's talking now about who revolted against the Romans. This city lay upon the border of Agrippa's kingdom, also did Sogane and Seleucia. Sogane and Seleucia being two other cities in the Golan, which we also don't know where they are. Both were part of Golanitis. For Sogane was a part called the Upper Golanitis, as was Gamla of the Lower. And Seleucia was situated at the lake of Semokitos, which is the area of the Chula Valley today. From here, from Josephus, we learned some things. We learned that besides Gamla, which is in Golanitis, there are two other cities, which we don't know where they are, Sogane and Seleucia. And we also know that the Golan is split into the Upper Golan and the Lower Golan. And we don't actually exactly know where these geographical areas are. We know they're in the central Golan. Archaeologists and historians debate it today, but it seems the Lower Golan is around the area of, we can say, Gamla, the area of the gorges of Zavitan and Yehudia. It's kind of an area which is not a nice flat basaltic plateau, but it's an area that has deep gorges going down to the Sea of Galilee. And the Upper Golan seems to kind of the more nice basaltic plateau that continues to the east into the area of the Choran. So we know the geographical distinction, which even today we're not exactly sure what it means. And we know the major Jewish area that will continue is more the area of the Lower Golan, which Josephus describes as Lower Golanitis. The fall of Gamla is really a major event for the Jews of the Golan. It's an area where 9,000 people were killed, where it seems that certain cities were abandoned, all destroyed, and it's the major event in the Golan that appears in historical sources. So everyday life, where did Jews live? How did they live in the Golan? We don't really know. It's not something described. It wasn't of interest to Josephus and his descriptions. But the fall of Gamla is of major interest to Josephus. He fortifies the site. He probably was at the site at the time of its fall after he was captured at the area of Yodfat, and he gives a wonderful description of the destruction of Gamla in 67 CE. He gives a great description first of how it's a well-fortified site, as this city was naturally hard to be taken, so Josephus, by building a wall about it, here he refers to himself in third person, of course, made it still stronger, and also by ditches and mines underground. So Josephus describes that he fortifies the city of Gamla, and these fortifications have been found by archaeologists. And the people that were in it were made more bold by the nature of the place than the people of Yodfat, Jopata had been, but had been much fewer fighting men in it, and they had such a confidence in the situation of the place that they thought the enemy could not be too many for them. For the city had been filled with those that had fled to it for safety on account of its strength. And then he describes the 7th month siege that also took place there. So Josephus describes Gamla, and what's important for us for understanding the Jewish history is that not only were there fighters in Gamla, but different people from around the countryside, and maybe from the Galilee also, refugees poured into the city of Gamla at the time of the siege. Now, what would make them think they could defeat 3 Roman legions? What would make them think that after so many other places failed, they could survive? It was because of the natural fortifications of the place. And Josephus, of course, also describes its destruction. It's a wonderful description, but here we'll only talk about the end of it. And so it happened that the anger of the Romans appeared not to be so extravagant, as with the madness of those that were now taken. Well, the Romans slew but 4,000, whereas the number of those that had thrown themselves down was found to be 5,000. It was hard for the Romans to conquer Gamla. They were defeated a few times when trying to capture it, and they, as the Romans would do, if someone revolted against the Romans and they did not succeed, then it was total destructions. So once the Romans entered the city, they destroyed everyone who was there. Some of the inhabitants go up to the top of Gamla, and Josephus mentions they threw themselves off. It's not clear to us today if he means that they committed suicide, or what seems more likely, that the Roman soldiers were making their way up and they had nowhere to go. They tried running down the northern side and found their way to their death. What's important also is this number of 9,000, because it includes people from the countryside, refugees, but it also includes the inhabitants of Gamla. The question is, after the destruction of Gamla and during the Great Revolt, what happened to the rest of the Jews living in the area of the Golan? For years, what we actually thought was that after the destruction of Gamla, there was a gap in Jewish settlement of the Golan. But more recent archaeological work showed us a different picture, that besides Gamla, there was continuous Jewish settlement. Besides Gamla being destroyed, there was continuous Jewish settlement in the Golan from the time of the Great Revolt going until around the 7th, 8th century CE, meaning that the Romans only destroyed the area that revolted, but areas and villages that did not revolt had continual settlement in the Golan. When we talk a bit about daily life, we'll have another lecture on this as well. An interesting fact concerning Gamla, and it probably is around the rest of the Golan as well, appears in rabbinic sources. When Gamla is described in rabbinic sources, and it's not described a lot, when it's described, it gives an interesting geographical mentioning. So here we're talking about a list of called Arei Choma, fortified cities. I'm not going to go into now the halachic reason they were talking about this case. What's important for us is the geography. And you have our different areas mentioned, different sites and where they are. And when it's mentioned Gamla, it mentions Gamla Bagalil, Gamla in the Galilee. Now, it's possible there was another place called Gamla in the Galilee, but what it seems more likely is that in the rabbinic sources, they describe Gamla as the Galilee because in the Jewish mindset, there is a continual Jewish presence from the Galilee going into the Golan. And so while they considered a different geographical area, in many ways, culturally, and if even geographically, they saw it as a continuation of the more central Jewish settlement in the area of the Galilee. And so this rabbinic source kind of gives us a hint to that kind of daily life where Gamla also seems to have a Galilean connection and likely also other villages in the Golan at that time. Another piece of archaeological evidence from which you can learn about Jewish settlement in the Golan in antiquity comes from a famous inscription known as the Rehov inscription. This was an inscription found in a mosaic in the synagogue of Rehov in the area of the Beit Valley. It's a very well-known inscription. It's the longest inscription we have that's written in Hebrew, and today you can see it on the wall of the Israel Museum. And this inscription actually is a second time they wrote it. Wall plaster found at the synagogue, which is currently being worked on its publication, also has a mentioning of this inscription here. What is this inscription? This is an inscription that also appears in rabbinic sources. So it's one of the few cases we have an inscription that both appears in archaeological evidence and in rabbinic sources as well. And this inscription mentions different sites and different Jewish villages that are part of those main cities that are mentioned. So you can have the area of Shomron, Sebastia, and the different cities that were around it. And you have the area of Nave, to the west of the Golan, and the cities that were, the Jewish villages that were around it. And you also ever mentioned the city of Susita and the different Jewish villages that were surrounding it. Here we see the inscription when it was being discovered. And here you can see the area that mentions the site of Susita and the different Jewish villages that were around it. If you remember the map we saw at the beginning of this lecture, we're talking now about we're not talking about the Jewish area of the central Golan, Golanitis, but Jewish villages that existed in the Roman period around the city of Hippos Susita. And here is a translation in English to this source. So the Jewish towns in the district of Susita, the point of the source was to know what was Jewish and therefore to knowing which laws, agricultural laws, had to be kept at those sites. And then there's a list of sites. Ayanush, Ein Chara, Dambar, Ayun, Yarut, Kfar Charub, Nov, Chispaya, Kfar Tzemach, and Rabbi Hitir Kfar Tzemach. Rabbi permitted Kfar Tzemach. Without going again into the halachic, to the Jewish law connotations of this inscription, what's important for us are the toponyms, the names mentioned here, and the geographical area. Some of the sites, based upon the preservation of names into modern time, and on archaeological evidence, we have been able actually to identify. And here's a list of some of the sites we've been able to identify, mainly based on what? The name that has been preserved. And this is something that we know more in the area to the west of the Sea of Galilee, in different parts of the land of Israel. But it's a phenomenon known throughout the Middle East, where peoples keep the same name of a site, even though they might change ethnically, religiously, and even their language changes. And this is interesting because some of these sites people might know today in the Golan. Chispin, Nov, Kfar Haruf. These are names of villages today in the Golan, but they're original names we know of from the Rehov inscription in antiquity. And these were names that were preserved by the different inhabitants over time. So these were the names when they were Jewish sites. There were the names when some of these were Christian sites. These were names when they become Muslim sites. These were the names in the 19th century and in the 20th century under Syrian rule. And these are the names still used today, which are either at those same sites in antiquity or very nearby. And all of these are in the southern Golan. Again, the major Jewish area that will continue for 800 years is a bit north of that, north of Chispin. But at least in the Roman period, we knew that of these Jewish sites, and some of these we've been able to identify. Another way of identifying Jewish sites in the Golan archaeologically is a way we identify in many areas of the land of Israel, and that's in a piece of archaeological evidence which we call chalk vessels or stone vessels. Chalk vessels, vessels made out of soft limestone, are very well known in the area of Jerusalem, in the area of Judea, but they're also found in the Galilee and Golan. And why are they important? Because they're well-defined chronologically and they're well-defined ethnically. These vessels, which can come as cups, tables, large jars, are only used by Jews, and they're only used at a certain time. And the time is at the end of the 1st century BCE, and going into at the latest, the 2nd, maybe 3rd, but likely until the beginning of the 2nd century CE. It's not something Jews used before that. It's not something Jews used after that, but it's a Jewish ethnic marker. So even in an archaeological survey, if you find remains of the vessels at the site, they tell you that Jews were there, and they also tell you when Jews were there. In a survey of the Southern Golan done by Sharia Friedman, which is finished his dissertation a few years ago on this topic, he published a map of different sites in which these chalk vessels were found in the Golan. And some of them were found in the central Golan, and that's an area we know that remains Jewish based upon the synagogue remains, we'll see very shortly. And in the southern Golan, which will become a Christian area in the Byzantine period, it's one of our few signs, archaeological signs of a Jewish presence in the Roman period, again at the end of the Second Temple period, and possibly a bit after the destruction of the Second Temple. Well, what happens after the Roman period? A few things happen after the Roman period. Here we're looking at maps which are showing you the Golan in between the Roman and Byzantine period. I just want to give you a quick reminder. The Roman period is talking about Roman rule, not that everyone is Roman inside the Golan. It's Roman rule. At that time, we mentioned that we have Itureans, a group of pagan ethnicity in the northern Golan, and Jews in the central and southern Golan, and mostly non-Jews of pagan religion in the southern Golan. And in the Byzantine period, when the Roman Empire becomes Christian, this will also have an effect in the Golan, where we'll have Christian tribes making their way into the northern Golan. We'll have a conversion of the local population in the southern Golan from pagan religion to Christianity, and some Jews either leaving or possibly converting, but the central Golan will remain Jewish. But another thing we notice, another phenomena, is we notice a drop in the number of settlements. This is a phenomenon that takes place all throughout northern Israel, in the Chula Valley, and inside parts of especially the eastern Galilee as well. And there's a drop in the number of settlements from the time of the Roman period to the Byzantine period. Maybe 60, 70 settlements, possibly a bit more, are abandoned in the Byzantine period and do not continue from the Roman period. But this is not particularly a Jewish phenomena. It happens all throughout the Golan, and even until today, we don't exactly know why this takes place. In any case, what we see here is that the Jewish population will continue, but it will continue mainly only in the central Golan, in the western central Golan. If we take a look, it jumped for me for a second. We'll go back to it. If we take a look at this chart here, we can see the number of sites in the Golan based on archaeological survey. These are not the number of population, but the number of sites that archaeologists found, and it's mainly based upon archaeological surveys. And here you can see a few things. One, the Hellenistic and Roman Byzantine periods is when the Golan reaches its height. There are more sites, and it seems also definitely more people than even living in the Golan today. But we also see it reaches its peak in the Roman period, and then it drops into the Byzantine period, and this will happen in the Jewish area as well. Do Jews abandon certain areas, but do they move into other villages? Do they abandon it entirely? These are things that we don't know until today. Our major evidence for a Jewish population at this time in the Golan comes from ancient synagogues. And I'm sure some people here know some of these synagogues. These are synagogues at Kanater, Katzrin, some that are open to the public. But these are ancient synagogues which left wonderful basalt stone remains. And we have such a good preservation of these synagogues because in many of these villages, they were not continuously settled after they were abandoned in the 7th, 8th centuries CE. Unlike the Galilee, unlike other areas in the land of Israel, where there's a more constant continuation of settlement, and meaning that different pieces were used again over and over and over again, in the Golan, many of them were remained, or they were used in secondary use in more modern villages at the end of the 19th and into the 20th centuries. In the Golan, we know of around 30 synagogues, remains of 30 synagogues in the Golan, which is a very large number, of which only 10 have been excavated. So only about a third of them. 2 of them are dated to the Roman period. That's the synagogue at Gamla and my excavation at Majdulia, which we'll talk about a bit today and a bit more also in our next lecture, as well as 8 other synagogues which are dated mainly to the Byzantine period, but some it seems actually were also already built at the end of the Roman period. And this is wonderful archaeological evidence for Jews at the time, especially because we are lacking almost any sort of historical source on Jews living in the Golan in the Byzantine period. Here we can see a map of the area of the Jewish settlement from the Roman into the Byzantine period. And what you see in orange were settlements that were abandoned, Jewish settlements that were abandoned at the end of the Roman period and did not continue into the Byzantine period. What's also interesting is that they left very few remains of monumental structures. And thus we don't actually know too much about their synagogues and their remains. The Byzantine period synagogues are much more grandiose, and we actually see their remains much more clearly at archaeological sites, even in surveys without excavating. If we take a look at the synagogues that were found in the Golan, most of them date to the Byzantine period. Much more in the synagogues we're going to talk about in our session that we're going to give to the synagogues, because out of the 130-something synagogues found in the country, 30 of which are from the Golan. And so they deserve some special mention, and we'll give a lecture specifically on that topic. But these synagogue sites give us a wealth of information on the society that built them, on the Jews who used to live in the area of the Golan. And some of it we know from the art remains, and some of it we know from inscriptions as well, from Jews in the area of the Golan. And here we'll just mention some of the inscriptions that were found in the Golan. So now I'm going to the area of Ein Nashot. This is a site a bit north of Katzrin. It's actually a site you can go and visit today. It's not a site that's very well visited. It's just a bit off of the road near the modern day village of Kidmat Tzvi. And this is a site that has a wonderful synagogue that's there. And while part of a sewage area was being built, a pipe was being excavated, so there was found there the lids of sarcophagi, of burial tombs. And these sarcophagi lids are today inside the Katzrin Antiquities Museum. And what's important for us are the inscriptions. In fact, the Golan is one of the few areas in the country where there's tens of inscriptions from the time of the Roman and Byzantine period. And here you can see an inscription written in Aramaic, and the top lid shows you Shimon bar Abun, and then it says that he died, and then you can see at the end is Chaf Vav. Chaf Vav, which is for 26. So it gives us his name, and it gives us the age of 26. And here we can learn about the age of when someone passed away. Maybe it was someone of prominence and important that he receives his own sarcophagus. And also we know his name, the name of his father, and we also know something about his language. What's interesting is nearby, another lid was found, and this time it's in the language of Greece, which is mentioned to Oseus, Zaneo, et O. And again, this is probably a corruption also of a Greek way of naming of a Jewish name. And here it's also mentioned the year that he died, meaning 70 years old. At that time on burial inscriptions, we don't mention the date of death, but they do mention how old the person was when he died. So here we have a site where we see both Aramaic and Greek, which probably tells us something about this population in the Golan that was speaking both Aramaic and Greek at the time, because an inscription on a burial grave is not really for the deceased, but it reflects more about the person who wrote it and what languages they were speaking. Here we see also tombstones. These are unlike sarcophagi. This is from a site known as Asalia. It's inside a nature reserve today, and sometimes it's open to the public. And it's a bit west of the area of Katsrin. And here there were also found a number of tombstones. These tombstones are interesting because it was hard for archaeologists to see them at first. They kind of look like regular basalt stones. And when you flip them over, you suddenly notice that there's inscriptions inside. The one in the bottom shows you actually how they were found, etched inside. And only when you use chalk or some paint inside, you can stress the letters that are mentioned. So here we see another tombstone, and we'll focus here on the one on the left. There we can see a name written in Aramaic Hebrew, Nachman bar Sachak. The name Nachman is a name that we know well from Jewish sources of the time. And the one to the right is hard to know exactly what the name is. It seems the first letter is missing. Maybe it's Shlomi or Lami, something of that sort. And then we see Bar. And on the bottom line, also a name that seems to be Shin Lamed Mem Yud Hey. In many inscriptions, the Chet and the Hey kind of look the same. So here again, we have another name of someone mentioned, or at least two people mentioned from the area of Asalia, and this was found a bit outside of the village. Interesting that many times the burial areas, they're not inside the village, but they're on a hilltop across from the main village. There's tens of burial remains, or let's say not of the remains of the skeletons themselves, but of inscriptions of burial found at different sites of the Golan. And the truth is, if we ever do another lecture series, that could be something that we can give itself its own topic. We're going to end here with probably the most famous inscription found in the Golan dealing with the Jewish population. And this is an inscription found at the site of Dabura. The site of Dabura is actually on a trail that many people know, but almost nobody goes to the ancient site itself. The site of Dabura is above the gorge of Dabura, Nachal Dvora, or sometimes known as the Jilabun. And up above the Jilabun, above the area of the waterfall, you can leave the path and go up to a small village. It's an abandoned Syrian village. And in many, many areas of the Syrian village, you can see in secondary use tens of remains of Jewish public buildings from antiquity that were reused inside the modern day houses. This village was abandoned and surveyed in the 1967 emergency survey and in subsequent surveys, and even in more recent documentation by a team that I belong to. Here you see a picture of Shmario Gutman, which he found in the mosque of the modern day village. It was used as a lintel in the mosque. And again, it wasn't that they knew that it was part of a synagogue, but they saw a very decorative stone they decided to use in secondary use. And here we can see him looking at this stone that he found. And he as well was himself was surprised to find on it an inscription. Today you can see this stone inside the Antiquities Museum in Katsrin, which truth is a wonderful museum. It's not visited enough. And if you come to the Golan on a rainy day, I very much suggest visiting that museum. It will show different time periods from the Golan, including the Jewish remains. And what we have to see is what's written on the inscription. So we see two birds of prey and a wreath in the middle. This is a common artistic motif that we know of in the antiquity. It's not particular really to Jews, but inside of it, we can see in Hebrew written, Ze Beit Midrasho Shehala Rabbi Elazar Ha-Kappar. So this is the house of study of the Rabbi Elazar Ha-Kappar. Elazar Ha-Kappar is a rabbi who we know from Talmudic sources. An interesting note is that there are incredibly few remains we have, almost none, of people mentioned in Talmudic or rabbinic literature who we also found remains of their names. That shouldn't be surprising. It's very hard to get that type of bingo of someone who's mentioned in a historical source in antiquity, and then to find, let's say, the burial remains or the remains of that actual person. It's very rare. And in many cases where it does happen in archaeology, you're always questioning, is it real? Is it a fake? is someone trying to trick you. In this case, there's no question about the authenticity of this. And Rabbi Elazar Ha-Kappar, we know of from Talmudic sources. He lives around the time of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, and we know of different sayings that he has. In fact, one of the most famous sayings that he says is don't be like the lintel of a building, but be like the threshold, because the threshold always stays in its place, and the lintel is something that can be removed. Interesting, we found his lintel, the top of the doorpost in his building, that was removed from its original place. The building of the house of study of Rabbi Elazar Ha-Kappar, which was in Dvorah, we have no idea where it is. In fact, archaeologists, we think that there may have been more than one public building at that site. And this inscription is important because, one, it mentions someone from rabbinic sources, and it's one of the few cases where that happened. He also has those famous sayings, for example, Hakina, Atava, Vakavod, Motzin et Adam min ha'olam, right? Where he says, he mentions different attributes that can take someone out of this world, that someone should try to refrain from having, such as jealousy and envy, someone should refrain from having. And we wonder, but Elazar Ha-Kappar in rabbinic sources does not appear ever in the Golan. He appears as Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi by the area of the Galilee, when in other areas. Where are we finding a Beit Midrash to the Golan? So that's one question that we have. We don't know why he's there. The other question is the Beit Midrash. In fact, this is the only archaeological evidence really of Beit Midrash, of a house of study. When I mentioned the 30 synagogues of the Golan, well, they probably studied there, but what's the difference between a house of study and synagogue in antiquity? In rabbinic sources, they appear as two separate ideas, two separate buildings, but in archaeology, we can almost never really differentiate between them. Or, if I want to be more careful, we know what a synagogue is, we don't really know what a house of study is. This is clear archaeological evidence of a house of study, because it's mentioned, but we don't know where it is at the site. But maybe like Rabbi Elazar Ha-Kappar said, his threshold maybe was not removed, and maybe it's still there. So we also don't know exactly of the time period as well. Some archaeologists look at the motifs there, and they look at the artistic style, and they say it's not really from his time. His time, to say, is around the year 200. It's probably somewhat later, which could be as well. And in that case, this isn't really referring to Rabbi Elazar Ha-Kappar in the Golan, but a group of people who continued his philosophy and lived there. Overall, today, what we tried to look at was a brief introduction to the Golan. We talked a bit about the geography, the name of the Golan, archaeological and some historical evidence. We saw that we know of Jews being there from the time of Yanai, and we can mention there was continuous Jewish settlement in the Golan for a period of 800 years, which is a very long time in antiquity to have the same type of Jewish ethnicity, in fact, of any sort of group that remains in one area. And what we'll do in our next part of our series is we're going to focus a bit more on the daily life, how we see that from the synagogues, and how we see that from the pottery from these people. Thank you very much for listening.